I was quite struck, in fact, by the fact that the Daily Star, which is a proper funny newspaper, I think they get it out on a shoestring these days. To be fair, they got it out on a shoestring when I was still working on the newspaper upstairs from them. But I think there's only about 3 people on the editorial floor, and they routinely... Didn't they come up with the lettuce? Wasn't it them that came up with the lettuce for Liz Truss? They've obviously got some comic geniuses and some good journalists in the building. And today they go for international affairs. Today they cross the Atlantic and christen J.D. Vance J.D. Dunce, which I grant you, it's not going to have Oscar Wilde looking to his laurels, is it? Or worrying about his status as one of the greatest wits of the last 200 years. But it fits. That's the point. Is this the most dangerous man in the world? They ask. J.D. Dunce hates Britain, hates Europe and hates Ukraine and could be US president at any moment. That's one elephant in the room that many people seem to be a little wary of acknowledging. Donald Trump is quite an old man and quite fragile. And while I wouldn't wish harm upon anybody, you have to be conscious of the possibility of him not being here for the full duration of his presidential term, in which case absolutely no questions asked. Easy as pie, J.D. Vance slides into the Oval Office and begins to enact, I suspect, more ideologically driven poison than Donald Trump is minded to deliver. Donald Trump will always do what is best for Donald Trump. What we don't know is what is best for Donald Trump, because we don't know whether Vladimir Putin has got anything on him. We don't know what the financial consequences are of some of the decisions that he makes. The days of Jimmy Carter putting the family peanut farm into a blind trust lest anybody fear that he might be using his office to enrich himself are a very, very, very long way away. I don't think anybody questions the simple fact that the Trump family use the patriarch's power to enrich themselves on an extraordinary scale. So there it is. If the Daily Star are asking this question, then everybody is at BBC. I've got a superb piece, which I recommend very highly on their website, by Alan Little, which simply states Trump has blown up the world order and left Europe's leaders scrabbling. John Bolton has written for the Prospect magazine this month, arguing the opposite in many ways, arguing that the New World Order is not being blown up and that Europe must act almost on a waiting game, preparing for normality to be restored. John Bolton, I think, was on with Tom Swarbrick earlier this week and has very much detached himself from the regime that he was part of in Trump's first term. I don't think I agree with him, but I'm sure he'll be untroubled by that news. What I do want to know is why you think these men and women hate us so much. I give you a really intellectual answer. It's not mine. I got it off Blue Sky. In response to the question of what it is that informs this really vicious dislike. It's not ideological or even political. It sounds deeply personal, some of this stuff. It really does. And probably best encapsulated in that line from the Vice President, I just hate bailing out Europe again. Not I don't want to, or I have a problem with it, or I'm not sure we should. I just hate bailing Europe out again. And then the Secretary of State for Defence replies, I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic. And he uses capital, of course he does. He uses capital letters. So this is the weird bit, right? Here's a very clever answer to the question that I do understand, but I had to take a moment just to make sure I got my ducks in a row. Can somebody explain to me why these people loathe Europe so much? To which one answer is international social democracy is in systemic competition with oligarchic nationalism, at which point you kind of need Phil Daniels to poke his head around the studio door and shout Park Life, don't you? But it's probably true. The second bit of the story, or the second answer to the question, only literally struck me, well, not literally struck me, but only presented itself to me as I walked into the studio and glanced at my phone, where I learned that the GLA has undertaken some research into social media posts, hate-filled social media posts directed at the Mayor of London, Sir Sadiq Khan, and found that they more than doubled last year. These are profoundly Islamophobic messages, and the assessment revealed that 89% of the posts since 2015 originated on X. So if you are familiar with what has happened to that place since Elon Musk took it over, then you will be unsurprised to learn that it has become an absolute swamp, a festering sore of race hate and Islamophobia, misogyny, and all manner of other behaviours, some of which, of course, have seen a very bad actor recently be arrested. So there are your two extremes, your deep end and your shallow end. At the deep end, international social democracy is in systemic competition with oligarchic nationalism, altogether now, part life. And at the other end, they are getting their image of Europe from these mad blue-tick post-Musk accounts on Twitter that dedicate themselves almost exclusively to acts of violence being undertaken by people who aren't white. Quite often they're even lying about where the footage was filmed, and they never ever acknowledge the existence of violent people who are white, like a famous footballer who finds himself in the former footballer who finds himself in the news this morning. So those let's take those two poles. One is quite a profound and troubling philosophical principle, international social democracy, which is everything that we thought we were protecting during the Cold War, everything that we thought had won when the Berlin Wall came down, versus oligarchic nationalism, which would be Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia, most obviously, and increasingly perhaps Trump in the United States of America. So this analysis suggests the reason why people like Vance and Hegseth really hate Europe is because we still just about manage to offer up an alternative to oligarchic nationalism. So a kind of society where a tiny number of incredibly rich people, and if they weren't rich to start with, they will be soon, preside over almost everything, untroubled by things like the rule of law, courts, judges, media, controlling the media. Simon Mark spoke to us yesterday about how carefully they are ensuring that there'll be no dissent in the Oval Office. Yesterday was a wonderful example. The President of the United States of America claimed that he knew nothing about the biggest story in the world, involving his own deputy, his own vice president, his own most senior staff. But he could sit there now in a broken media ecosystem and claim that he knew nothing about it. But these messages here are not political. They are profoundly personal. If this was, just very briefly, to get it off my chest, if this was normal times, if this was normal politics, even vaguely normal politics, then the most significant thing that happened in that exchange, that they originally tried to deny the existence of and then subsequently claimed wasn't their fault and then claimed didn't contain anything sensitive and now has the National Security Advisor taking full responsibility for it. And you're quite right, we'd add Netanyahu to that list of oligarchic nationalists, increasingly so. I think the most important element of the conversation would be Vance outing himself to senior colleagues as being opposed to something that Donald Trump had decided to do. That may well prove to be, for Kremlinologists of the White House, that may prove to be the most significant domestic issue, in that Vance has accidentally outed himself to Trump as a critic of Trump. Does it matter? Possibly not. It's not that long ago, of course, that Vance wondered whether Trump would turn out to be America's Hitler. I'm not making that up, by the way, in case you don't pay as much attention to this stuff as I do. So there it is. They really, really loathe Europe. It can't be limited to exasperation at European refusal to spend more on defence. That doesn't explain the degree of hostility, this visceral hatred that Vance and Hegseth seem to have, and presumably the rest of them, because nobody stepped in to correct them, but they seem to have for Europe. Why do they? Do you know, I find it almost unbelievable that the only other times I've ever asked a question that could be distilled down to 5 words, why do they hate us, is when we've been discussing things like Al-Qaeda or Islamist terrorism, the Manchester Arena bombings or the July the 7th attacks in London. To think that we have sat here together and wrestled with the question of why these people hate us, people that may be our neighbours, people that may live among us. They hate our way of life. We were talking about abject terrorism, and now we're talking about the most senior members of an administration which until 2 months ago was widely regarded as one of our, was correctly regarded as our staunchest ally. So I'm looking at the Vice President, I'm looking at the Attorney General, I'm looking at the National Security Advisor, I'm looking at the Secretary of State for Defense. I'm reading what they say, and I'm wondering why they hate us. That's a moment, right? The only other time I've done this phone-in has been about Islamist terrorism. And now we're doing it about the American government. Why do they hate us? What is it about Europe that they hate so much? I'll take anything you've got. I've set the goalposts so far. You can move them. Of course you can. It may be that there is something I've missed between the tension between oligarchic nationalism and liberal democracy, or they are simply avatars. They are simply permanently, perennially online, far-right half-wits who truly believe the depiction of Europe that you get on some of these blue-tick accounts called things like 24 Hours to Save the West. Oh, sorry, I think that might have been Liz Truss's last book. Or We Will Rise Up, or Rule Britannia, Britannia Waves the Rules. What else would explain it? 03456060973. They hate Europe. They are ignorant, it would seem, of the Marshall Plan, which we, of course, touched on yesterday. Another history lesson that I have undertaken myself recently involves Lord Inverchapel. Do you know who Lord Inverchapel was? Lord Inverchapel was the UK ambassador to Washington in 1947. And one morning in February of that year, he walked into the State Department to tell the US Secretary of State, George Marshall, he of the Marshall Plan, that the UK was no longer capable of supporting Greek resistance to communist forces. Now, if the communists had taken Greece, they would soon have taken Turkey. If the communists had taken Turkey, then you would have had essentially Soviet control of potentially the Suez Canal, certainly of the Eastern Mediterranean. And that was something that the United States could not countenance. Soviet control of crucial routes and populations. So almost overnight, the United States stepped into the vacuum left by the departing British. If you don't think all of this stuff is linked, I should tell you that at around the same time, Britain had announced its plans to pull out of Palestine and India and to wind down its presence in Egypt. This is 1947. This isn't 1822. This is 1947. There were people alive then who are still alive now. And what George Marshall put together was the New World Order, in which America was the policeman of the world. Harry Truman, the president, announced it must be a policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. That was the United States credo. It was almost as sacred as the inscription on the Statue of Liberty, and they spent the best part of 100 years delivering on that. And now the Vice President, the Attorney General, the National Security Advisor, and the Defense Secretary hate the very idea that they are the guardians of the free world. Because, and I think this might be one of the answers to the question that I'm asking, they don't want to be in the free world anymore. They want to be in the world of oligarchic nationalists. They want to be in the world of governments that do subjugate free populations, that do control the media, silence dissent, remove critics, deport non-criminals in order to briefly sate the gnashing jaws of their largely ill-informed supporters. That was the moment that leadership of the West, the leadership of the Western world, the free world, call it what you will, shifted from Britain to the United States. As Alan Little writes on the BBC website, more accurately, it's the moment that revealed the shift had already taken place. But the formalisation of it comes in these two memos, one about Greece, one about Turkey, that Lord Inverchapel hands to George Marshall, essentially saying, we haven't got the money, we haven't got the people, we're too tired, we're too skint, we're too indebted, largely to you, United States. We can't support the Greek government forces fighting an armed communist insurgency. And if they fall, what else falls? And that's the point at which the United States became the country that we know it to be today. A country which, in the space of 2 months, it has ceased to be. So, why do they hate us? 0345 6060 973. Why do J.D. Dunst, Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, Why do they hate Europe? Why do the most senior politicians in the United States of America hate Europe so much?